David Clendon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ki ngā manahiri, ngā hapu, ngā whānau o Waitaha, tēnā koutou katoa. So I'm pleased to take a short call on behalf of the Greens to speak to this important piece of legislation and to reaffirm our support for the passing of this very significant bill. So I've enjoyed a couple of times this morning my whanaunga Tau Henry speaking of his regret at the lack of attention that we as New Zealanders pay to our own history. And he's commented earlier that perhaps I was, and he indeed were, some of the exceptions to the rule, having parents and family who enjoyed and revelled in learning and speaking about New Zealand history. But for many New Zealanders of my age and even younger, they grew up knowing about Geronimo and Sitting Bull and Robin Hood, but knew next to nothing about Te Raupraha, Hongihika, Kawati, Te Koti, extraordinary men living in extraordinary times and doing extraordinary things. And in that context, I must confess that my own knowledge of the story of Waitaha was fairly minimal up until coming to grips and reading this bill. And it's a sad story, it's a heartbreaking story, but it's also a story that is represented in the doings of their tipuna Hakaraia, who showed the leadership which was so common in Māoridom. The leaders at that time, they were warriors, they were philosophers, they were writers and poets, but critically they were leaders. They took on the responsibility and the burden of leadership at a time of incredible change when an entire history of a people was under threat, and they retained that. Their strength of purpose, their example remains for us in the present day and for the descendants of those extraordinary people to remember their sacrifice, their efforts, and to carry that forward into the future. So the story is well told, as ever, in the bill of Waitaha, and it's a very succinct story in the telling, in this context anyway, but it's one I recommend to any New Zealander who wants to know more about the history of this country, and particularly of that area. And it's noted that after the death of Hakaraia, particularly the Tauranga Raupatu, that took away the economic underpinnings of people of Waitaha and very nearly led to their demise entirely. And sadly, that is a story that was repeated across the country. People, families, hapu, iwi, can survive a great deal, but cannot survive the complete loss of the land that sustains them and that had sustained them for many generations. So I think we must acknowledge that in entering into the settlement that, as ever, Waitaha are foregoing full reparation, as have iwi and hapu throughout the country. I've heard a figure that typically the settlements in terms of value represent between 2 and 5% of what was lost. And again, we must admire and acknowledge the generosity of ngā iwi katoa who take that hit, who accept much less in return. But critically, they hear the apology of the Crown, they hear the acknowledgement of the mana whenua, and that is equal, at least in value, as the land, the resources, the financial redress that comes along with it. Sir, I'd like to quote our late and much lamented friend Parakura, who in an earlier debate on this very bill, in reference to Waitaha, he said, "There is a feeling in me that this is one of the most persistent tribes in all of Māoridom." And sir, I reflect on, I think you could put up a lot of nominees for that award of the most persistent, but I will certainly bow to Parakura's superior knowledge. And for an iwi to win that award from that gentleman, I think is remarkable. Persistence is a quality we all admire. It speaks not only to the determination of the people who have endured so much for so long, but it also speaks to the integrity, the essential rightness of their claims on their very justified demands for restitution over the generations. It's my pleasure on behalf of the Greens to acknowledge ngā tūpuna o Waitaha, the iwi, hapu and whānau of today, who have worked so hard to get to this point, whose objectives in their negotiations include cultural revitalisation, social enhancement, and economic and political participation, and the settlement of this legislation we're passed today will make a contribution to enabling that. I'd like, on behalf of my colleague Catherine Delahunty, who unfortunately is unwell, or else she would take an opportunity to speak today, I'd just like to quote briefly from her speech earlier, again in a debate on this bill. She talks of meeting with some Waitaha people who laid out around the issue of Newmont Waihi gold and glass earth gold in their aspiration to mine Muir's Peak. Catherine said, I met with some Waitaha people who laid out very clearly their passion for their maunga down to the ocean, their passion for preserving their waterways and protecting the area for mining. It was very humbling to have met those people, and I want to acknowledge them. And so I'd greet Waitaha on Catherine's behalf, and I'm sure she will continue in that shared battle to protect the whenua. So Māori and Greens share an essential concern for the well-being of people, for the well-being of whenua, the well-being of ngā awa, ngā moana, and we recognise that those are interwoven, that they are interdependent, that the well-being of one determines the well-being of another. Toi tū te marae o tānei, toi tū te marae o Tangaroa, toi tū te iwi. To the extent that we damage the land and water, we damage ourselves. Restoration of land and water is also restoring our own well-being, and these settlement processes are a step towards that restoration, and for that reason they'll welcome them. So this bill provides acknowledgement and recognition of the mana whenua of Waitaha, and as ever the Greens are pleased to see mana recognised and restored, not only for the people of Waitaha, but for the land and waters, which we know they will make an enormous contribution to restoring, to bringing back to life, to bringing back to the quality that is within them. We wish Waitaha well, and with real pleasure we continue to support this legislation. Kia ora.
Brendan